we starting now? Okay, we're starting now, Tracy.
I love it.
Tracy, good to have you with us today.
Thank you, Tyler. I appreciate this opportunity, and it's always good to be able to open the book and get with a friend and do a study.
For those of you that don't know, Tracy is one of the elders here at the Judson Road Church of Christ in Longview, Texas. Tracy, we're glad you're here with us. We decided we were going to talk some about 1 Peter today.
You helped me. We're staying in my wheelhouse because we just got covered in my adult class, and I was pretty frustrated when all this weather stuff, or not weather, but all this corona stuff hit us, that I didn't get a chance to finish it, and it's been a great book.
It has been. So, Tracy, as you're looking at 1 Peter, if you were going to give us a summary of the book, what is the book of 1 Peter all about?
Well, there's two things that stick out that I think you and I hopefully will be able to get into and pull out of this. The first is the opportunity to be holy. Mm-hmm. And the second part really is the endurance factor, because as a lot of people know, Peter wrote this to a people that were having to endure some hardships.
Sure.
And I feel like we can relate to that during this time in our congregation.
All right.
I think we can make application for it.
So let's dig into that some. Let's look at chapter 1, starting here in verse 14. We get kind of our theme for the book. As obedient children, do not be conformed to the former lusts which were yours in your ignorance, but like the Holy One who called you, be holy yourselves in all of your behavior, because it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. So holiness is really the lens through which we're viewing the rest of the book of 1 Peter.
Right. And there's a sense of being holy and being considered God's people. You know, in verse 2, elect according to the foreknowledge of God the Father and sanctification of the Spirit for obedience and sprinkling of the blood of Jesus Christ. You know, this idea that we're separate because we are the people of God.
So one way we demonstrate our holiness is by being the people of God. That's right. Chapter 2 and verse 2, like newborn babies, long for the pure milk of the word, so that by it you may grow in respect to salvation. One of the ways that we're holy as God's people is that we long for the word.
Absolutely. And there'll be other opportunities as we look through this that goes back to the word.
Sure.
And the truth.
The gospel has a big role and a big place in the lives of God's people.
Yes.
But not only that, you look, for example, at verse 11. Part of being holy and being a child of God is what, Tracy?
Well, my notes here say living like a pilgrim. It says, beloved, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lust which war against the soul. To be a pilgrim.
So, as a Christian, this world isn't my home. We sing about it a lot, but we're challenged to live it out. This world is not my home. As a Christian, I recognize God as my Father. He's the one I want to go and be with. And so my life is not so much concerned with what's going on here. I'm living for something greater and something beyond.
Right. And it picks that thought up in verse 12, where it says, having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles. When you speak against you as evildoers, they may be your good works which they observe. Glorify God in the day of visitation.
So we're beginning to get this theme of endurance already, right? Here they were facing hardship, being spoken of poorly by those who were around them, but there's this message of endure.
Yeah, and it's going to start bleeding into their relationships, the relationship with themselves, but also there in verse 13 it talks about the government and being submissive that way.
Great point. So here's another way that we're holy in 1 Peter. We're holy by being submissive. And in verse 13, the first realm of submission we're talking about, Tracy, like you mentioned, is being submissive to civil authorities, to government.
Right. And that the role that we play with our government is kind of fitting in what we're dealing with now when, you know, local people tell us we can only congregate in certain groups and so forth and so on, that this submission to the government, it kind of matters, Tyler.
Let's look at verses 13 and 14. Peter would say, submit yourself for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king as the one in authority, or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do what right. We get kind of a broad plan for what civil government is supposed to be and what is not supposed to be.
Yeah, and then where is it in Acts where we're to obey God rather than men?
Acts chapter 5. So this is not a carte blanche, whatever the government says, you
Yes.
do it. But it's rather we look at what God has said about government. We look at God's expectation for our lives. We always err on the side of God.
Absolutely.
But in as much as it depends on us and as much as we're able, we're going to be submissive to civil
And
government.
I think the big point here is to be a good citizen.
Sure.
You know, that we are good citizens, and what the government asks us to do as best we can inside of our realm of being a Christian, we do try to do.
And we'll try to make that a little bit more apparent as we move on here, especially into chapter 5. Let's look at verse 18.
Verse
Not only
18.
do we need to be submissive to the civil government, but Tracy, you were bringing out verse 18 earlier.
Yes. The role we play within our companies or with how we interact with people in terms of business, our employers, and sometimes being a good employer or being a part of a company, you are a good employee, but you're a good employer as well, whichever role you play in that.
Even if the person above you might be somebody who is less than desirable.
Yes, even though sometimes you might have a tough job,
Sure.
you're still expected to do your job.
Verse 18, Peter would tell us to be submissive not only to our good masters, but also to those who are unreasonable.
And this role of submission, whether you're submitting to the government, submitting to your employee, carries over into chapter 3.
Sure it does. We look at chapter 3 and verse 1. This idea of submission is carried over. Now we're not talking about civil government. Now we're not talking
Now we're in the
about
home.
We're in the home, exactly. And wives are to be submissive to their husbands, and that is kind of controversial in our society today, but nonetheless it's a biblical principle.
It's there.
But sometimes that biblical principle is kind of maybe magnified, and we miss verse 7.
Yes. Let me grab verse 7 and maybe even verse 8. But verse 7, husbands likewise dwell with them with understanding, giving honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers may not be hindered.
That word likewise there in verse 8 or verse 7 rather, is really, really important. It ties together that we're still talking about this concept of submission.
You know, I think good husbands understand the role of submission that they have.
Sure.
Even as heads of their household. Their role is still to be submissive as well.
We're to look after our wives. We're to seek to understand them. We're to respond to them in ways that they need. Not necessarily the ways that we think they need,
Right.
but the ways that they need.
Chapter 3 of 1 Peter has a lot of meat in it. It talks about submission here, but a lot of us, including myself, love what it gets into when it starts talking about baptism and the role of submission to the gospel.
Absolutely. Chapter 3 and verse 21. Peter's going to say, corresponding to that, after having referenced the story of Noah and the flood, corresponding to that, baptism now saves you, not the removal of dirt from the flesh, but an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
And to keep the thought of everything Peter's talked about to this point, being holy, enduring hardships, being submissive to your government, being submissive to your employer, being submissive to your spouse, but not only all those things, but having a good relationship with God himself, and to be able to put yourself in a relationship with him.
I think that's a great point. Now, if we're in a relationship with God, chapter 4 and verse 2, that brings with it a specific way of living.
That's right.
If I'm going to be holy, if I'm going to be a follower of God, I've got to live God's will out in my life. Chapter 4 and verse 2, live the rest of time in the flesh no longer for the lusts of men, but for the will of God. Now, Tracy, if I was to ask you, what does Peter say is the will of God here, where might you have us look?
Well, I would continue the thought there in verse 3, for we have spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles when we walked in lewdness, lust, drunkenness, revelries, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. You know, this idea that was then, that was the life we've lived, and now this is the life we are to live now.
Sometimes God's will embraces what we're supposed to do. Sometimes God's will embraces what we're to abstain from.
Yes, and to be able to use good judgment, I think is the term that you and I have talked about regarding all of this, that wherever you are on some of these concepts, there's no doubt it's expecting us to have good judgment.
Verse 3, we might quibble on what some of these definitions mean, but in verse 7, the point is made for us that we have to exercise sound judgment, good judgment. That if we're being told that these things are not a part of God's will, then good judgment is going to say what?
Good judgment is going to say you engage in certain things and you stay away from certain things.
I think that's a good way
And
of
the
looking
concept is even carried over in later chapters where it talks about just being sober and sober-minded,
Absolutely.
those type of things. And I hate before we get out of chapter 4 without getting into verse 8, Tyler, where it says, and above all things, have fervent love for one another. This idea that we have a relationship with each other, and that is part of God's plan as well.
This isn't just some sort of empty checklist we're going through and there's no real relationship,
Yes.
no real emotion. Part of living according to the will of God is loving each other, not only emotionally, not only mentally, but also physically reaching out and
Good.
doing for others.
Excellent
what they might
point.
need.
Because, and remember, to keep it all in the context, these are hard times. People were going through hardships. I think of the 21st century, I think of the hardships we're going through now, and this attitude and this disposition and this idea that we are supposed to love each other.
Chapter 4 and verse 12, you talk about the hardships. That's exactly what Peter transitions to talk about. Verse 12, Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal among you which comes upon you for your testing, as though some strange thing were happening to you. Verse 16, But if anyone suffers as a Christian, he is not to be ashamed, but is to glorify God in this name.
Again, we're in that the realm of endurance
Yes.
and holiness. And those two things are carried right on through all of 1 Peter.
If we're going to be holy, we're going to live according to the will of God. If we're going to live according to the will of God, we're going to endure even when times get difficult.
And we'll be able to do those things.
Through the strength that He gives us.
Absolutely.
Let's wrap up with chapter 5 then.
Chapter 5, the concept becomes watchful. Pay attention. I mentioned being sober a while ago. The verse that sticks out in chapter 5 to me is verse 8. Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks about it like a roaring lion, seeking who he may devour. That roaring lion concept is just something, I get a vivid visual of that.
So if we're going to be watchful, we've got to know who our enemy is.
Yes, and he puts it right out there for us, that there is an enemy. He is real.
And here's what he wants to do. He wants to devour us. This kind of cartoonish picture we get of Satan sometimes, that he's dressed in red and he's got horns and a pitchfork and he's kind of dancing on our shoulders. That's not quite the picture of Satan that's painted by the biblical authors.
Absolutely. And to avoid him, to avoid being eaten by a roaring lion, we need to identify who he is and the realness of him.
So here we go. We've identified who Satan is. We know what his intentions are. But verse 9, there's a response that you and I can have, that you and I are called to have.
Yeah, this ability to resist.
So Satan is powerful, but he's not all powerful.
He doesn't run everything.
He
runs a lot, and he is dangerous.
But you and I can resist him.
We can resist him every day.
How would Peter tell us to resist him, Tracy?
By walking by faith. The key word, I think, here is having a response that includes faith.
Resist him, Peter would say, steadfast or firm in your faith.
And that faith is what will get you through the endurance. It'll allow you to be holy. It'll allow you to do all the things that God has asked us to do.
So it's going to be faith that is the key in resisting Satan.
And Peter does such a good job here of laying it all out and keeping a fairly complex message pretty simple that we can understand.
It's one of the hallmarks of Peter's writing, right? A little bit more understandable maybe than Paul is sometimes.
Yes, and I think it's very appropriate for the time we're in now, Tyler.
Sure. So let's recap our big picture here. 1 Peter, the message is be holy.
Being holy and enduring tough times.
We're holy, chapter 2, by being God's people. We're holy, chapter 3, by being submissive. We're holy, chapter 4, by living God's will. And then, Tracy, we wrap it up in chapter 5.
We're holy by being watchful and being a part of his gospel.
Tracy, anything you want to say, especially to our members at Judson Road?
No, I really appreciate the opportunity. And I know there's a bunch of people, there's over 100 people that can't wait to get into these pews again, and let's get this thing done.
Well, we look forward to that. Certainly, we're prayerful to that extent. Thank you all so much for joining us. We hope to be together again next week and do a study like this again. Stay safe. We'll talk to you later.
Bye, everybody.